4 engines, 100 feet above black water, and no way of knowing what was waiting at the end of the runway. The Indian crews had never seen this airfield. No lights, no tower, no one on the radio. If the island was held, they were landing straight into the guns. It was called Operation Cactus. A country of 1,000 islands had been taken in a single morning by men hired for money. Its president was hiding in a borrowed house, working through a telephone directory of capitals. Every one of them told him the same thing. We cannot reach you in time. The Maldives is 1,200 islands strung across 500 miles of the Indian Ocean. Its capital, Malé, is barely 2 square kilometers of concrete and coral, packed tighter than almost any city on Earth. It had no army. Its entire defense was a few hundred lightly armed policemen. Abdullah Luthufi was a Maldivian businessman in exile who wanted the country for himself. He had no soldiers, so he rented them, roughly 80 fighters from a Tamil militant group in Sri Lanka, paid to take an island nation. Against them stood President Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, and almost nothing else. They came by sea in the last hours of the 2nd of November. A chartered freighter standing off the atoll, speedboats running in under darkness, engines cut for the final approach. Some of the gunmen were already ashore, landed days earlier among the tourists. Nothing on that water was being watched. Malé woke to automatic fire. The gunmen moved fast through streets narrow enough to block with a single parked truck, taking the port, the radio station, the telephone exchange. In a city 2 kilometers across, holding 4 buildings is very close to holding the entire country. The National Security Service headquarters was the only hard target on the island, and the fighting there was the worst of the morning. Men trained for Coast Guard duty and crowd control found themselves in a close-quarters battle against professionals. With no reinforcements coming from anywhere, they held anyway. Maldivian servicemen died at their posts that morning, and civilians died in the streets outside. The toll in Malé is usually put at around 19. For a country that small, 19 is not a statistic. It is a list of names everybody's family recognizes. The gunmen went for the presidential residence first. Gayoom was not in it. He had been woken and moved minutes ahead of them, out through a back lane, into an ordinary house belonging to an ordinary family. The coup had already failed. It would take another day for anyone to be certain. What followed was a search. Small teams working building to building through a capital where nothing is more than 10 minutes' walk from anything else, looking for one man. They held the harbor, they held the airwaves, they held the streets. They did not hold the president. In a room he could not leave, with a telephone that still worked, Gayoom started making calls. Colombo, Islamabad, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, London, Washington. He was not asking for sympathy or a resolution at the United Nations. He was asking for soldiers, and he needed them that day. The sympathy was immediate and completely useless. The nearest American forces were days of sailing away. The British had no one within reach. Sri Lanka was busy with its own war, and the men shooting up Malé had come from there. Every answer amounted to the same sentence. The request reached New Delhi through the Indian High Commission in Malay and Maldivian officials abroad, and it landed on desks that had nothing prepared. There was no contingency plan for the Maldives. There had never been any reason to write one. Rajiv Gandhi took the decision that same day. India would go. The Prime Minister, his officials and the service chiefs settled it in a matter of hours, a speed owed less to brilliance than to the fact that there was simply no time to consult anybody else. Then the planning started, and the first thing anybody asked for was a map. There were none. No military chart of Malé, no plan of the airfield. No photographs of the buildings, the quays or the streets. What they eventually found were tourist maps. Everything else came down a telephone line. The Indian High Commissioner and a handful of Indians living in Malé described the city from memory, which quay a boat could tie up against, how wide the lanes were, whether the airport island was still clear of gunmen. That last question decided the entire shape of the operation. Malé has no runway. The airstrip sits on Hulhule, a separate island 1.5 kilometers across the water. If the gunmen were holding Hulhule, then there was no way into the country at all. At Agra, the 50th Independent Parachute Brigade was told to move. The task went to the 6th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment with gunners of the 17th Parachute Field Regiment under Brigadier Farooq Bulsara. They were given the name of the country and very little else. Men drew ammunition without being told what for. Officers studied a tourist map of an island city none of them had ever seen. The flight was roughly 2,000 kilometers, almost all of it open ocean, and the place they were flying to might already belong to somebody else. The lift was flown by Ilyushin 76s of 44 Squadron. Heavy four-engined jets, long-legged, and the only thing in the inventory that could put a battalion onto a runway in a single night. They staged south through Trivandrum and turned out over the sea. There were two plans, and one of them was terrible. If Hulhule was clear, they would land. If it was not, the paratroopers would jump, at night, into the sea, off an island held by men with automatic weapons, and swim toward the fighting. While the aircraft were in the air, the gunmen in Malé were taking hostages and shooting at anything in uniform. They had spent an entire day failing to find one man on an island you can walk across. Their plan had assumed a country that surrendered before lunch. The Ilyushins came in after dark on the 3rd of November. No approach lights, no ground control, no friendly voice on the radio to say what was standing at the end of the runway. The crews flew that final leg on a telephone call and a folded tourist map. Wheels touched at around 9:30 at night. The ramps came down onto an empty, silent airfield. Nobody fired. Within minutes, Indian paratroopers held the runway, the terminal, and the fuel dump. And the man they had come 2,000 kilometers for was still on another island. There was no bridge. There would not be one for another 30 years. Between that runway and the capital lay 1.5 kilometers of black water, and the only way across it was whatever floated. Harbor boats, a ferry, anything with a working engine. They crossed in the dark, packed standing on open decks, rifles pointed at a shoreline nobody could see. 2 machine guns sighted on that seawall would have turned the crossing into a massacre. The gunmen had put nothing on the seawall. They were still hunting through the streets behind it. The first Indian troops came ashore before midnight, and the street fighting was short. Men who will fight for money do not, as a rule, die for it. Some groups surrendered where they stood. Others broke and ran for the harbor. The city changed hands in a few hours. Gayoom was found exactly where he had been all day, in a house that looked like every other house on the lane, alive and unhurt. He walked out with Indian paratroopers around him. By the small hours, the government of the Maldives existed again. By first light, the island was quiet. Indian sentries on the junctions, prisoners sitting in rows on the quay, shopkeepers out looking at the damage. In New Delhi, the messages were already being drafted. It had taken about 12 hours, and it looked finished. It was not finished. When the harbor was counted, a ship was missing. Around 40 of the gunmen had reached the docks ahead of the paratroopers and seized a freighter, the Progress Light, and they had taken hostages aboard with them, roughly 27, including a cabinet minister and his wife. So the last act was fought at sea. 2 Indian frigates, Godavari and Betwa, were already moving. A freighter makes 10 knots, a frigate makes nearly 30. There was never any question of the Progress Light outrunning them. The question was what would happen to the people aboard. They caught her off the Sri Lankan coast. The frigate signaled. The freighter kept going. Pressure was applied, and the men aboard answered it the way cornered men do. Hostages were killed and put over the side. Accounts differ on how many, somewhere between 2 and 4. Godavari opened fire. Not into the hull, where the hostages were, across the bow, then into the upper works, until the freighter was no longer going anywhere. The engines stopped. The shooting stopped. 40 men who had set out to buy a country surrendered to a boarding party. The surviving hostages were taken off. The Progress Light went down not long after, and the prisoners came home in the belly of an Indian warship, to be handed to the government they had spent a day trying to destroy. The whole affair was over in about a day and a half. Count the cost. Around 19 dead in Malé, most of them Maldivian servicemen and civilians. 2 to 4 hostages killed at sea. No Indian soldier died in the operation at all. For a nation of under 200,000 people, that morning removed an entire village. The reaction abroad was immediate. Washington and London are both reported to have thanked India publicly and warmly, which does not happen often. Luthufi was tried and sentenced to death, later commuted. And India had demonstrated something it had never demonstrated before, that it could act, and act quickly. The hardest part of saving a country that night was landing an aircraft on a runway nobody could see, on the word of a diplomat with a tourist map. In this ocean, ever since, India has been the first phone call.